We often blindly trust people we have known for a long time. However, this does not mean that some of them do not hide dark intentions, masked by smiles and kind words, just waiting for the right moment to act. This happened to me in 1990, and it left me a widow. Well, more or less that. My name is Antonia, and what I'm going to tell you here happened to me with a cursed snake, my ex-husband, Fernando. The stories are also from Fernando's diary, a letter he left me, reports from employees, the snake's parents, and a police report. I will tell you how it happened. Larissa Albuquerque always knew that she did not belong in the life she led. Since she was a child, she looked down on her family, as if they were all too weak to aspire to anything beyond the misery in which they lived. The interior of Minas Gerais offered her nothing but dust, hardship, and a mediocre existence. Her mother, a humble, soft-spoken woman, did her best to keep the house in order, while her father worked in the fields day after day with calloused hands and a tired look. But Larissa never had patience for this reality. She would get irritated with her younger siblings and would easily become enraged. Sometimes, her anger would boil over in brutal ways. Once, she pushed her own mother against the furniture, shouting cruel words. Her father tried to intervene, but she would not back down. Her gaze carried something that no one could understand, a thirst for power, a desire for greatness that went beyond what anyone there could offer. To the neighbors, Larissa was just a rebellious young woman, someone who dreamed of a better life. But within those four walls, her presence was a burden, her gaze a warning of a storm. Determined to escape that miserable fate, Larissa seized every opportunity that came her way. She quickly mastered reading and writing, finished elementary school, and, with great effort, managed to get private lessons for high school. That's when she met me. My name was Antonia, a well-connected and respected social worker in the region. I saw great potential in Larissa and naively believed that I could guide her on the right path. However, for the young woman, I was just another piece in her game. She admired my influence, but felt no gratitude, only the certainty that one day I would occupy an even greater place. But it was in another environment that Larissa found true power. Among the many lessons she learned, one would mark her forever: the secrets of candomblé and the paths of witchcraft. It was Mother Denise, a feared woman in the community, who opened the doors to this world for her. With a profound gaze and a strong presence, Mother Denise saw something in Larissa that no one else saw, a soul willing to go to any extreme to achieve her goals. Together, they spent hours in rituals, preparing baths, prayers, and powerful works that made even the most skeptical fear. Under the guidance of her mentor, Larissa learned to manipulate energies, bend the will of others, and, above all, transform her desires into reality. Now, the power was in her hands. When she turned 19, Larissa received a tempting offer. Her husband, Fernando, and I proposed that she come work in their house as part of the domestic service. In exchange, they would pay for her college studies and provide her with housing. To anyone else, this might seem humiliating, but Larissa knew that this was the key to escaping the hole she had been born into. Being in the city, she would find a way to free herself from this situation and achieve something much greater. After all, her ambition and the perversity that dominated her would make her capable of anything to achieve what she wanted. When she finally arrived at my house, Larissa was impressed. The house was large, organized, with a beautiful garden and a swimming pool. Every detail exuded luxury and comfort, everything she had always wanted. I introduced her to my husband, Fernando. As soon as he saw her, the man made an expression of disgust, but he kept his comments for later. "Welcome, Larissa," he said, without enthusiasm. Despite his cold tone, he explained her tasks in the house and the schedule she should follow. Then he called one of the servants to take her to her room. As the months went by, Fernando increasingly showed his displeasure with Larissa's presence. It wasn't because of her competence, because the young woman learned quickly and did everything perfectly. The problem was something else. Fernando was an elitist and despicable man. He despised Larissa for her humble origins, something that was evident in the humiliations he imposed on her. He overloaded her with tasks and, whenever he could, insulted her. I, realizing the situation, decided to confront him. "Fernando, tell me what's going on. Why do you treat this girl like that?" "What are you talking about, Antonia? She's here to work, and she's paid well for it. You always swore that you would support me in my work of helping those in need. This is different. I'm getting fed up. That country girl embarrasses me when we have visitors. Besides, there's something about her that bothers me. Just looking at her makes me angry. Are you listening to what you're saying? I don't recognize you anymore. Oh, don't talk nonsense, Antonia. Or do you want to go live with her up in the hills, in the middle of the mud and the smell of cattle?" The conversation was so intense that Larissa could hear everything. But instead of feeling sad, she became furious. She already knew that Fernando despised her, but hearing him talk about her that way awakened a deep hatred. She needed revenge. The young woman had always known how to manipulate situations to her advantage. And now, with all the knowledge she had acquired from her mother Selena, she knew exactly what to do. In the following days, she began to collect everything she needed for a spell. Strands of Fernando's hair, pieces of his nails, a photograph. It was just a matter of waiting for the next full moon. That night, Larissa performed the ritual. Her words were spoken with precision, her offerings left in the right place. A crossroads. The desire was clear. Fernando would bow before her, would only have eyes for her, would love her until the end. A love spell made with hatred and revenge. And it worked. The next morning, Fernando was different. For the first time, he treated Larissa with respect. The cold and arrogant look had disappeared. The days passed, and the change was even more evident. Fernando now seemed enchanted by Larissa. At first, he only showed kindness, but soon his attentions began to turn into flirting. I noticed everything, but I refused to believe it. Larissa was old enough to be our daughter, but before I could act, I had to travel for 2 weeks for work, and it was during my absence that everything changed. On the first night alone with Larissa, Fernando couldn't resist. His obsession had become uncontrollable. He went to the young woman's room, took her in his arms, and kissed her desperately. Larissa didn't resist her. Deep down, she knew the spell was working perfectly. Now, Fernando was just a pawn in the game she had started. In the following months, Larissa adapted to life in my house. To everyone, she was a hard-working young woman dedicated to her work and studies. However, behind her humble and obedient appearance, there was a calculating and cold mind, always planning her next steps. From the first time she entered that house, Larissa knew that she wouldn't be content just to work there. She wanted it all: the life of luxury, the respect, the influence. But above all, she wanted power. And to achieve that, she had to play patiently. The biggest obstacle in her path was Fernando, my husband. From the beginning, he showed contempt for her, not only because of her humble origins, but because he felt something strange about the young woman. Her presence bothered him in a way he couldn't explain. He didn't just see a maid there, but something that made him uneasy. Fernando was a cold and arrogant man. Despite being successful, he had a fragile ego and a constant need to feel superior. He didn't miss any opportunity to humiliate Larissa, whether with cutting comments or by overloading her with unnecessary tasks. I, on the other hand, tried to protect her. Protect a snake so it could bite me, poison me, finish me off. In the house, the servants noticed the change. The man who had previously avoided any interaction with the young woman now seemed enchanted by her. Fernando's obsession with Larissa Albuquerque grew every day. The previously arrogant and distant man now followed her with his eyes from every corner of the house, like a predator bewitched by its own prey. I, always busy with her care work, took a while to notice the changes in my husband, but the house servants were already whispering about what was happening. Larissa, for her part, was amused. Every gesture of Fernando was a confirmation that his magic was working. Deep down, she felt contempt for him, not only because of his elitism and arrogance, but because he was now just a puppet in her hands, an old and ugly man. She smiled with satisfaction. Larissa was the new lady of the house. The days that followed were pure pleasure for Larissa, not because of the man, because she despised him, but because of the power she now had over him. Jose did everything she wanted, from expensive gifts to small demonstrations of submission. The house was no longer the same. The servants realized that Larissa was in control and began to fear her. Fernando had become an unrecognizable man. He no longer made decisions without consulting her. He did not dare to contradict her. In the second week, one of the employees, overcome with guilt, sent me an anonymous letter telling me everything that had been happening. When I returned home, I found a scene that seemed like a nightmare. Fernando, previously a proud and respectable, he was now a devoted servant of Larissa. He didn't try to deny anything. He simply looked at me and, without hesitation, ordered her to leave his house. I was shocked. I tried to argue, to beg, but Fernando was unyielding. He threatened, shouted, pushed, until I, devastated, was forced to leave. Larissa watched everything in silence, with a slight smile on her face. Now, the house was hers. More like a scorned and deprived wife, I went to court to defend my rights. This was not going to be cheap for Fernando and his young lover. The young woman celebrated her victory in the following days. With Fernando's assets and money now under her name, she began to live a luxurious life. She bought expensive clothes, went on trips, found new lovers. Fernando, in turn, became increasingly dependent on her, more submissive, weaker. But Larissa knew that this would not last forever. The spell was not eternal, and Fernando was beginning to realize the truth. The days became endless for Fernando. The blind passion that consumed him was now mixed with something new, doubt. Ever since he had thrown me out, he had felt that something was wrong. but his mind seemed foggy, as if he were constantly under the influence of a bad dream. He watched Larissa enjoying everything that now belonged to him. Her expensive clothes, her luxurious dinners, her nights out. She was always surrounded by other men, and Fernando was no longer the center of her attention. Once a respected man, now ridiculed. In the solitude of his empty house, something began to bother him. One night, while drinking more than usual, he found himself staring at his own reflection in the mirror. Who was that man? Where was the Fernando of before? And then, like a lightning bolt cutting through the darkness, flashes of his old life came to his mind. Antonia. The name echoed inside him like a cry for help. He stood up shakily. He felt sweat running down his forehead. What had he done? How could he have thrown his own wife out? A growing anguish took hold of him. Something was wrong. Something unthinkable. Then a memory came to him. Larissa. That night, before everything changed, he remembered her whispering strange words, mumbling things as she ran her hands over his clothes. He hadn't paid any attention at the time, but now, could she have bewitched him? The thought hit him like a punch. That uncontrollable desire, the way he was overcome by obsession. It wasn't natural. He didn't love Larissa. He never had. It was just a desire. It had all been an illusion. And now, he felt that something dark was surrounding him. With this new awareness, Fernando realized that he needed to get rid of Larissa. But it wouldn't be easy. He could see the fear in the eyes of the employees who were still left. They feared her. She seemed to know everything, as if she had eyes in every corner of the house. But Fernando was a patient man. He would wait for the right moment. And finally, the opportunity came. One night, Larissa went out to meet one of her lovers. Fernando was alone in the mansion and took advantage of the opportunity to act. He went to her room. He searched everything. And then, in the back of the closet, he found something that made his blood run cold. A box. Inside it were her belongings, strands of hair, scraps of her clothing, a photo of her tied with red ribbons. And in the center of it all, a small wax doll pierced with needles. There was no doubt left. She controlled him with magic. Fernando's anger exploded inside him, but he would not do anything impulsive. He knew that, in order to win, he would need to be smarter than her. He put everything back as it was and left the room, taking a deep breath. Now, he was certain of one thing. Larissa would pay for everything, and he would bring justice himself. Fernando spent the following days pretending that nothing had changed. He remained obedient, always attentive to Larissa's wishes, as if he were still under her control. But inside, he was a volcano about to erupt. Larissa, on the other hand, was becoming increasingly bold. She went out frequently, came back late, and no longer worried about hiding her affairs. Fernando, even burning with hatred inside, swallowed every humiliation. He knew he had to play her game until the right moment. So, Fernando decided it was time to act. He hired a private investigator to follow Larissa. He needed proof of her betrayal to justify anything that might happen later. And it didn't take long for the man to bring back valuable information. Larissa didn't have just one lover. She had several. And one of them, in particular, was someone with whom she seemed to be planning something bigger. A young lawyer who often accompanied her to discreet meetings. Fernando wasn't surprised. He knew she wasn't stupid. She was preparing her exit. and she probably wanted to rip it off. "Knock me down," he laughed, shaking his head. "You still haven't realized, have you?" Priscilla frowned. "What?" Fernando stood up slowly, approaching her. "You've already destroyed me. Larissa, I'm not the man I used to be. There's nothing left for you to take from me." She narrowed her eyes, feeling a growing irritation. "I can't believe it. You still have this house. You still have money. You still breathe." Fernando leaned in until his face was close to hers. "Then end this once and for all." A deadly silence settled between them. Priscilla felt something inside her hesitate for a moment. But then, as if an invisible force controlled her, her fingers moved, reaching for the dagger hidden under her coat. Fernando didn't move. She plunged the blade into his chest. Fernando's eyes widened, and he let out a choked gasp. Larissa held him as he collapsed on top of her, feeling the warm blood stain her clothes. Fernando opened his mouth, but no words came out, only a faint smile before his head fell. She pushed him to the ground and stood, staring at the lifeless body before him. Finally, he was dead, but then she heard the click of a trigger. Before she could react, she felt the violent impact against her chest. An absurd heat took over her body, followed by a biting cold. Her eyes widened when she saw the gun in Fernando's hands, still pointed at her. He was still alive. "Not yet, my dear. We're partners." Larissa felt her knees, gasping. Blood dripped from her mouth as her vision began to darken. Fernando, with the last of his remaining strength, grabbed her arm and pulled her to the bed. The two fell together on the white sheets, which quickly turned red. Their breathing became weaker, slower. Before everything faded away, Priscilla felt Jose's fingers move slowly, tracing something in the blood that was dripping between them. His face getting closer to hers. On his lips, the last kiss. The kiss of death. When the police found the scene the next morning, the two were there together, their bodies intertwined on the bloodied bed. Eyes in eyes, lips close together. And beneath them, written on the sheet with their blood, was a single sentence. "Now we are eternal partners."